All right. So again, welcome back to week 5, day 4. Today we're talking about pseudocoding. So today's lecture is only going to be approaching this challenge from a pseudocode perspective. So we'll start off at a very high level and then get down into the nitty-gritty bits of um, classes and methods and variables. But we're going to stop short of actually writing executable Python code. So as the prompt says, you need to create a travel package class. Note, first thing, that this is a class. And the class needs to be able to get a list of destinations and prices from a pre-formatted CSV file. And I'll give you guys that format. It needs to get a user budget. It needs to be able to get a user's destination based on a budget that they provide. And then display a confirmation message to the user about a destination that they have chosen. So where do we go with this? I mean, this seems like a pretty tall order. Um, how can we break this down just conceptually speaking? What are things that we should keep in mind?
Need to create a class.
All right. Yep. So we'll just say, so let's start that down here. So travel package class. And what other things should we do or keep in mind? Just in terms of overall, like 101, here are things we need to do or keep in mind before we start getting into variables and functions and all that jazz.
Oh, is it the input and the output?
That's part of it. Um, yeah, so we can, but that would be more for the functions. And so what I'm trying to get is what are the parts of a class or things that classes have that we will want to think about when we're pseudocoding?
Attributes.
Attributes. Perfect. Thank you, Mike. What types of attributes are there?
Class and variable?
Yep, so you have your class attributes, then we're going to have your instance attributes. And remind me how we instantiate or initialize instance attributes.
The init function or method,
Init
init
function.
method.
Yes, init dunder method. So we're going to need to do that as well. Init dunder method. So those are a couple of things that we need to get done. And then we have these four functions that we need to write. So the first one is going to be, so we're going to separate this out. So we have our list of things we need to do. So we have that getting a list of destinations and prices. You have getting your user budget, getting a user destination based on the budget, and display a confirmation message. All right. So let's start thinking about attributes based on the functions that we've written. What, or that we, or correction, based on the functions that we need to write, what are some class attributes and instance attributes that we might need? So we can probably start with the class attributes. What things are class attributes from this list?
Something that every class will have that you instantiate.
Mhm. So what might that be?
The destination.
Yep, a list of destinations and prices. So let's add that. So we have list of destinations and corresponding prices. Okay. Are there any other class attributes in this based on what we are given that come to mind immediately?
Maybe a confirmation message. Just reading through the pseudocoding here thing.
Okay,
Like,
yeah,
because
that could work.
the frame of the message is always going to be the same, I imagine.
Sure. Yeah, so we could say boilerplate for a confirmation message. Anything else?
What about the budget? Is that I'm not sure.
That is a good question. So let's go back to thinking real life for a second. If you are running a travel company, your company has a preset list of destinations and prices. However, if you're designing a package for person A who has $10 and person B who has $10,000, the packages that you give them will be super different because they have different budgets. So because of that, I would say that the user budget would probably be a instance attribute because that's something that is different depending on the package. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So what other instance attributes might exist?
Probably the prices.
Hmm. So, well, those are already in the class attributes in that list of
Oh, okay.
destinations. No,
The
all good.
username or what we're gonna call the user.
Okay, sure. Yeah, you could say user name perhaps. Um, but just from these four functions, is there anything else that might be an instance variable?
The user's destination based on their budget?
Yeah. So, that again, that won't be, we don't know what the user's destination is immediately, but the user is going to have a destination. And instead of just having a function that we call every single time to get the user's destination, it might be nice if we just had a variable to store it. We could say user's final destination choice. That's probably good enough in terms of attributes for now. We can, again, the nice thing about pseudocode as well is you're never locked in. So, because you haven't written any code at this point, we're just writing things in English. That means it's really easy to change it without messing up running anything because you're not running anything. So, minimal consequences. All right. So, what we can probably now do is why don't we create some variable names for each of these? And maybe in addition to variable names, create. Yeah, actually, that's the main thing, and also the data types. So let's start up here with the destinations and corresponding prices. What is a good name for that? And here I wrote list, but do we want this to be a list, or is there another data format that might be better?
Maybe a dictionary?
Dictionary. Okay, why a dictionary?
Because you could list the destination and then the price of the destination next to it.
Yeah. Or I mean or to put it another way, you use dictionaries when you're trying to match one thing with another. We already have a list of things of destinations that are matched with prices from that CSV. So that fits the format best. So yeah, let's make this a dictionary. And I think that's a good choice. So Jonathan, since you're the one who correctly identified it as a dictionary, would you like to come up with a name for this dictionary?
I have no idea off the top of my head right now.
Anyone else want to volunteer a suggestion as well? Yeah, destination dict. That works. Or we could even do destinations prices dict. That way, it's really obvious what your dictionary has. Personally, I am always a fan of more descriptive variable names, even if it's a little bit longer, because we have copy paste. But also that way, when you're reading through your code, you know exactly what you're referencing. So And then we can have our boilerplate for confirmation message. That's probably going to be a string. And we could say something like, your, or no, we're not going to actually write it out, but we can just say, boilerplate, or we can say, confirmation template. That's probably good enough. All right. So there's one thing I'd like you guys to keep in mind. In general, we like to differentiate between class attributes and instance attributes in the way that we type them as well. So remember how we always make classes start with an uppercase letter and functions with a lowercase letter. So that way, if you're reading it, it's obvious that you're referencing a class versus a function. Well, we can do something similar with class attributes versus instance attributes, where sometimes people will write class attributes, especially class attributes that are constant and don't change, in all caps. So this would be something like uh, destinations dict. I'll just keep that, right? Destinations prices dict or confirmation template. And that way, when you look at it immediately, you know two things. Number one, it's a class attribute because it doesn't have the self dot. And then number two, when you look at the destinations, prices, dict all being uppercase, you immediately say, okay, that's a constant, and that's not changing. All right, so now let's write up our instance attributes. Super simple. We can just say user budget, username, and user destination. Okay, so it looks like we've got our main variables. And then now we have to think about our methods. So let's start off with that initialization dunder method. So we can do our, define init, and we'll have self. And right now we'll just put pass in there. But what things do we maybe want to initialize when we're initializing our class attribute? What things do we want to do?
You'll need to get their budget.
All right. So we can probably pass that in here, right? So why don't we pass in the user's name and the user budget? And then I know I said I wasn't going to write any code, but usually what I'll do when I'm pseudocoding is if it's easier to just write it as code, just write it as code. So, for example, here I could say set instance attribute of user name equal to input username. Or I can be a normal programmer and say self.username equals username. Which one's the easier approach? The second one. So even though pseudocode is not supposed to have actual code in it, to some extent, it's really if it simplifies your writing process, just write it out as code. It's okay. So we're going to do the exact same thing for self.userBudget is user budget. Oh, that's why. Here we go. I forgot to write down class travel package. That's what I was looking for. And now it's blue. Okay, perfect. So we're defining the user name, the user budget. We don't need that pass anymore. So we can say set user instance attributes. And is there anything else that we might need to do
Need
with
their
set?
destination.
Well, the user can't set their destination choice right now because they don't have any destinations to choose from.
Oh, that's relevant to their budget.
That's number one, it's relevant to their budget. But if we look at those class attributes, have we ever defined destinations, prices, dict yet? So how and where might we want to do that? So I guess first off, to backtrack, recall that we need to get a list of those destinations and prices from a CSV file. So we do not have a dictionary that I can readily just import into Python. So for our purposes, that means we're probably going to need to create a method to do this. So now in our pseudocode, what this means is create a function that imports a CSV file and returns destinations prices dict. Or maybe instead of returns, we can say, and it sets destinations prices dict to be some constant fixed value. So let me ask you guys this. So destinations prices dict is a class attribute, right? So it doesn't change regardless of what I import or regardless of what I do in the class, right? Is that a fair assessment? So because it doesn't, so everything else that we do in the class, whether that be getting the user's destination based on their budget and setting it and confirming it for the user, that all depends on the values inside this dictionary. So realistically, after setting the user instance attributes, we should probably set destinations prices dict as early as possible, right? So that way we're not running it, we're not running into problems later where we might forget to do that. Because right now, that doesn't exist. So what we probably need to do in order to set that is run whatever function we create. So let's write a function for that. So let's call it get destinations and prices. And for right now, we'll just input self and we'll just do a pass. So again, our goal is for this to import a CSV file and export, or the return value is going to be setting destinations prices dict. So how do we want to do that? And Justin, no comment. So let's start with the first question. We need to import a CSV file. Now, have we described that CSV file anywhere? Do I know what the name of this file is or where it's located or anything like that?
No, we have to find one.
Right. So let's backtrack a little bit more. Do every single time that I run travel package, where I'm creating a package for a user, do I necessarily need to provide the list, to provide this a different CSV file for every travel package?
No.
Yeah. The CS, so again, think about this like as a company, right? As a travel agency, you have a list of destinations and a list of prices that always stays the same, regardless, of who's shows up to the desk and says, "I want to know where I can go." That does depend on the budget at the end of the day, but forgetting the budget part, that list stays the same. So what we can assume, and yeah, this is a assumption, but what we can assume is up here we have path to CSV file is a global variable. So it's constant. So we can define, let's say, um, destinations, prices, CSV path, and we're calling this a global variable, destinations, prices. And for now, I'm just going to leave that in quotes. But we have a variable set now. Also, the nice thing that VS Code will do is if you define a global variable, aka you define it in all caps, it will highlight it in pink. So that way you know that that's different from, say, a local variable or a class or instance variable, which are usually in blue. So we have that path now. That's a global. So where do I go from there?
We would need to what? Open and read the file in our method, correct? And then
All right.
return that read.
All right. So we can open the CSV file, then read the CSV file. And then what happens when we read the CSV file? How do we want to read the CSV file?
I think you want to read it as a dictionary.
Yep. So we want to read it as a dictionary, which is pretty important. And then lastly, we can probably just say this is equal to CSV dictionary. So also, this is a big assumption and something I probably should have said, but generally when you're working with anything that requires data import, it's always a good idea to double check the format of the data first. So usually, like if I were doing this for an actual client, I would say, okay, can you give me a physical example of that CSV file? Because I'd want to make sure that it only has two columns, that it only has destinations and prices. If it has three or four or five or other columns or other data types, I can't read it as a dictionary anymore. I'm going to have to read it in some other way, like maybe using like a data frame or lists or something like that. Or I could use a dictionary, but it'd be a dictionary with nested lists. Yeah, we can get into complications. So always make sure when you're doing this that you have verified the data format. And for now, because this is a play example, we are going to assume that the data format of the CSV file has two columns, destinations and prices, and that's it. But that is a critical assumption, because if that is not the case, then our code will break. All right, so we're going to open the CSV file located there. We're going to read the CSV file, and then we're going to have our destinations prices dictionary is our CSV dictionary. So what type of method is get destinations and prices? Is it a class method?
Class method, we haven't really really gotten into the methods class or what instance methods, but
Okay.
is it something you can use without being in the class? Is that what we're, I still haven't differentiated between the two methods because they put the little decorators on there, right?
Yes. So what class? So I guess to discuss for the we have instance methods and class methods. So a class method is denoted by saying at class method, and then we'll say my class method, and then we'll just pass that. So when we normally define a method inside a class, we could say, so that would be your instance method. You always pass in self, right? Because the instance method works on the instance of the class that currently exists. A class method, however, takes in the CLS keyword because class methods don't apply to the instance. They apply to all instances of the class. So it's sort of like a class attribute versus an instance attribute, where it's self versus not having self. But when you run a class method, it applies across all instances of the class. So if we were to run get destinations and prices, recall that this destinations prices dictionary is a class attribute at its core. It's something that we set for all instances of the class. So in general, if you are modifying a class attribute, you'll want to use a class method in order to do so. And Sean, yeah, it's a class method because all instantiated classes will use whatever we set. Exactly. So because of that, we'll probably want to make this guy a class method and change self to CLS. Does that help? All right. Awesome. So yep, so we now have our first method pretty much boilerplated. So we have our CSV file being open, we're gonna read it, and then we're setting that equal to all des to our dictionary. So yeah, that looks pretty good to me. Now there's one thing to keep in mind. What we have to do here is first you always need to initialize, or not always, but it's good practice to initialize your class attributes up at the top. So what we're going to do is we'll just initialize destination prices dictionary to be blank. That way we can fill it in later. And where do we fill it in? Well, we're going to fill it in the function that we wrote down there. But in general, you want to leave it as blank. So now down here, sort of like with an instance attribute, you access it using self dot in an instance method. In class methods, you use CLS dot and then the name of your attribute. It's going to equal whatever that CSV dictionary is. I'm going to comment that. So now we can uncomment that line later. Jonathan, we will get to the confirmation method shortly. So keep that question in mind, because most of the time, the methods you write will be instance methods. However, not always. So when you're designing a function, just like we did with the attributes, it's always important to consider, stop and pause and think, is this an instance method or a class method? So it's always a good check because again, you can have instances like this where you very clearly want to have a class method. So let's go to the next one. So this function's been boilerplated out for now. Are there any questions about the get destinations and prices function before we go to getting the budget? All right. So let's say that instead of getting the budget, all right, here, let's write a function for getting the user's budget and then also setting or modifying a user's budget. Now, getting the user's budget should be pretty simple, right? Because we already have defined that in their instance attributes. So when I create a new travel package, I'm automatically importing the user's name and their budget information. So if I want to get a user budget, well, firstly, is this going to be a instance method or a class method?
It's going to be an instance.
Instance method. Yep, perfect. So let's just define it normally. We'll just say get user budget. And because an instance method, we were going to have self, which is going to pass. Or actually, we don't need to pass it. We can just write this function because all we need to do is return self.userBudget. And we need to just return that. Simple. Now, what if we wanted to modify the user's budget? I'll ask the same question again. Is that going to be a instance method or a class method?
Probably a class method because every instance is going to be able to need to use that to modify whatever budget is passed. But
Okay.
if you want to use the budget, you're going to need to pass self. So now I retract that statement saying it needs to be an instance.
Your conclusion is correct, but I would retry the logic a little bit. So the user's budget is something that is different between every instance of the class, right? So the budget of travel package A is different from the budget of travel package B, which is different of the budget of travel package C, etc. Because it's different for every instance, we'll make it an instance method. In contrast, destinations and prices is the same across all classes, across all instances, because it's a class attribute. So when we modify that, we modify it for every single instance of the class, which is why it's a class method. But because the user's budget is a instance attribute, we're just going to write an instance method to modify it. So we'll have set user budget, and presumably if we're going to set the user's budget, they should probably have like a new budget variable. And then what we could say, I guess, is self.userBudget is going to be new budget. So that's just updating the budget. It's pretty simple. You could print out a confirmation message if you want to. Print confirmation of budget change or something like that. And then just return nothing. Or, yeah. All right, we got two more functions left. And then it'll be up to you guys to code them. The first one is going to be getting the user's destination based on their budget. So let's go back and let's ask the same question again. Is this function going to be an instance method or a class method?
Should be instance, right?
Why should it be an instance method?
Because it's going to be dependent on the user's budget, not the whole class budget. Or
But isn't this also dependent on the on that destinations prices dictionary? Didn't we say that was a class attribute?
yes.
It's specific to the user, so it would be a destination. So Jonathan's correct.
Yep, perfect. Yeah. So that was a intentionally misleading second question.
Thanks for the backup, Sean.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're writing a function that sets an instance attribute, it's going to be an instance method. Even if it relies on global variables or class attributes or whatnot, it's still going to be an instance method at the end of the day. So good work, both of you. So let's define get user destination. And remember, we're getting it based on their budget, which we already have as an instance attribute. And that's also based on the destinations list or dictionary, which is a class attribute. So we actually don't really need to do anything else there. We don't need to take any inputs to that function. Right here, let's say destinations, users list of possible destinations. So how can I do that? So remember that the budget is going to be, so let's code that. So budget is self dot user budget, and then our dictionary is going to be this destinations prices dictionary, but we need to add a self dot there. What can we do? What should our rationale be?
If the price and destination prices is less than or equal to the budget, then return that destination.
Okay.
Or add
Yep.
all those destinations to a list and then return that list of destinations.
Perfect. Yeah. So let's append destination to a list of destinations. Yeah, that's probably a good idea. We could also maybe return the price or append the price as well. So what if we instead, let's say we create a new, let's see. Actually, yeah. Why don't we create a new dictionary of destinations and prices? And then we're going to do, if the destination price is, or let's see, what did they ask us to do? Oh no, they just said get a user's destination based on their budget. Okay, yeah, so I guess actually we would probably just go with the list in that case. So disregard that. So we'll append destination to a list of possible destinations, and then we'll just return list of possible destinations. So we are missing one thing here, which is we need to say for each destination price combination in the dictionary, and then we nest the if inside of that. And then we're going to return that list. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now you've given, we should probably take one step back. We've given the user now a list of, let's say that he's like, okay, my budget is $500. And he gets a list of like 5 different places he can travel. Now, even though the client didn't ask for this, it's probably a good idea for us to write some sort of a function that, given the name of a destination, can tell us the price of the travel package for that destination, right? To make sure that it's actually under budget. So let's also write up one more function. Let's say, given a destination name, return its price. So let's say, fine, get destination price. And now this does take an input. So we could call this destination name. What would this function look like? How can we do this based on the dictionary that we have and the input to the function that's given?
You just pull it out of the dictionary that we created via the CSV file, correct? You would,
Yep.
yeah, and then you would just return, we're getting the price, so you just return the price from that dictionary.
Right. Or even simpler, what we could say is we can just write this down now. Return destination's price is dict of destination name. So that way you're immediately accessing. So we're assuming here, we should also write this assumption down. Assumption is that this dictionary is going to be first row is destinations, first column is destinations, second column is prices. If that is not the case, then we might need to change some stuff in how we read in the file as a dictionary, might need to reorder some things. So assumptions of how your file is structured are very important to write down, and to do all of that in one consistent place. All right. So now the last thing is going to be displaying your confirmation to the user. So this is going to be our, let's say, display confirmation. And we should also probably allow the user to say which destination they want to go to as well. So in here we can say user destination choice. So what does this function look like? Lastly. So let's start at a high level. What have we done so far? Well, we've initialized the travel package. We've gotten a dictionary of our destinations and prices. We've gotten the user's budget. We've got a list of destinations that the user can choose from. So now they actually need to choose a destination. So the first thing we should probably do is check if the destination they chose is allowable or is allowed. Okay, under budget, right? Because if it's not if the destination, if first, aka the destination exists, because if, let's say the options they give you are like New York, Chicago, and Tampa, and you're like, no, I want to go travel to Greenland. That's not a valid option. That's not in the list. If it's not in the list, you can't book it. So that's the first thing we want to do is make sure, hey, does the destination actually exist? And then B, make sure that it's under budget. And then if both of those are true, print out or return or return that confirmation template with changes made for username, destination, and price of travel package. Oh, and we need to say pass because we're not actually writing that function. Does that make sense so far? Any questions about any of the pseudocode or boilerplate that I've written before we move forward? So to recap, the first thing that we did when we looked at the problem statement is looked at what attributes our class needs to have from the get-go. We broke it down into our class attributes and instance attributes. Once we did that, we thought a little bit about the initialization dunder method and what things need to be set and how. Then we realized we need to set one of our class attributes. And we wrote a function to do that. When we're setting a class attribute, you're going to write a class method to do so. And we talked a little bit about opening and reading CSVs and the importance of checking your data types and making sure that you're understanding the difference between importing as a dictionary or as a list or as some other data structure. Then we just wrote very, very basic functions for getting and setting budgets, which are instance methods because the budget is something that's already passed in. We wrote another function for getting the user's destinations. Even though it takes into account both instance and class attributes, this function is still a instance method because the user destinations for one user are going to be different than the destinations for the other. We then wrote a one-line function for getting the price of insert destination, and then a function that allows the user to book their travel package by making sure that the destination they want to go to is valid, and then it returns a confirmation. So we've been writing this pseudocode for about 45 minutes at this point. And keep in mind, the only code that I've written is setting that this dictionary is a blank dictionary, writing a 2-line init dunder method, writing get and set user budget, and that's because both of those functions are easier to type than to write out in English, and because they're really self-evident. The same thing for get destination price. Everything else we have done here is pseudocode. The next step is to turn each of those mini functions that we wrote in English into an actual function that roughly follows the pseudocode we wrote. Or if it doesn't, we write more pseudocode and then we write the functions after. Any questions about the procedure that we just followed before I turn you guys loose to do it on your own?